I want to work in the video game industry. Video games are my passion and nothing could be better than making them for a living.
I should warn
This was one of the first videos I saw when I was figuring out if I wanted to be a game developer. Then I was the cardboard robot, wide-eyed, curious, wanting to show the world my great ideas.
But my idea is great.
What is your idea?
I can't tell you. You might steal it.
You cannot just expect someone to hire you because you say you have a good idea. Besides, everyone has game ideas. Nobody cares about yours.
The point of the video wasn't to discourage people from being game developers, but to pull back the glamour of the industry, then leave the viewer to decide if they still wanted to be a game developer or not. It's a little outdated at points and it focuses on the big budget industry.
The video game industry does not exist to be creative. It exists to sell products at Walmart.
But I recommend you watch it after this video, link below. As far as you need to know, I'll be taking the role of the sad-looking robot. Full disclosure though, I come from a self-taught designer-programmer background. I have an associate's degree, not even unpackaged. I learned programming to make games and little else. And part of being self-taught is that there's a few gaps of information that I didn't know until I had to learn them. What I'm saying is, take my advice with a grain of salt. Before we get into it, I'm compelled to bring context to the environment developers work in, both big and small. First thing you need to know is that out of all the subsections of the tech industry, gaming is the most fickle and least secure. If you're going into games to make money, I would recommend looking elsewhere. Being a developer is not easy. Most big studios overwork their staff with unpaid overtime, and in the case of Telltale, can shut down after a few years of mixed success and relying on investors. On the indie side, it's sometimes less secure. Payment differs from project to project. You may get lucky and find an hourly payment system, but that doesn't guarantee employment or health insurance. It's more likely to be a revenue share project or a paid per milestone project. And even with all that in mind, 5 to 10% of indie games ever make a profit. The other 95 to 90% don't make a profit, and that's not counting the ones that never see the light of day. Developers that have continued to work in this industry and make a living were either skilled, lucky, or crazy enough to pull it off. However, if you're planning on being a hobbyist and don't plan to make money off games, a lot of this doesn't apply. I say these things not to deter, but to be transparent. So if that crushing reality hasn't scared you off, we can get into the details. First things first, you gotta choose your discipline. I'm not gonna cover art or audio because I want an actual expert with me. I'll be focusing on design and programming because that's what I do. Design focuses on rules and context of the game. What the game is, what it's about, win-lose conditions, the goal of the levels, sometimes level design, the who, what, when, there, why, all of that. What makes a designer different from a producer is that they're still in the trenches like everyone else. They pretty much make the blueprints of the game. If you want to start learning, there's several good series and talks on game design and game theory out there like Game Maker's Toolkit and various GDC talks. But personally speaking though, designers aren't in the trenches enough. And I admit, a lot of this comes down to personal experience. Some of the designers I've worked with on school projects, game jams, and a couple of indie gigs tend to lean more on the producer side than the designer side, where they spend more time communicating with other departments for assets and tools. This is common in the big budget side of the industry where teams are huge, but in the indie scene where any given member is wearing multiple hats, it could come off as an imbalance. And this isn't to throw shade at designers, it's just an observation I've made over the years. If you do plan on being any kind of designer, I would recommend picking up a secondary discipline on top of that, being programming, art, or audio. That way you can get a general idea of what goes into implementing a certain feature. Programming is focused on putting all the parts and assets together. It's what makes the game work, or the nuts and bolts of the system. Otherwise, you might have a very pretty environment where the player character couldn't move, or a camera angle that never changes. There are many types of programming: gameplay programming, tools programming, shader programming, etc. Find a language you want to learn, start learning it. There's tons of tutorials for each language, from basic terminology or just how to do a certain thing. Going through the tutorials will also cover actual programming logic and a couple of good programming practices. The great thing is that even if you have no knowledge of anything else, you can at least get things working in prototype. Some of the negatives are that despite our sometimes introverted behavior, we can be very proud of our skills to the point where using someone else's code for our projects fills us with a sense of disgust. Of course, if you have a deadline or a client is asking you to learn a certain tool from another programmer, not much you can do there. It all depends on the big picture of the project. Just think pros and cons, or how much time will this save and will that weigh against the system you've already made. Okay, You chose your specialty/skill tree, now for the tools. The phrase, making games is easier than you think, isn't accurate. It should be, making games is easier than ever, but it's still difficult. There are more tools to make games than there has ever been, but the process of putting that together is still an uphill battle. Sure, the tools are already made for you, but you have to learn those tools. A lot of them are free, but they probably have features locked behind paid tiers. For example, you can't get rid of the Made with Unity splash screen on the free version of Unity. You can go the high road and make your own engine, and if you want to go that route, be my guest, but it's a very hard road when starting out. All I can do is shed some light on the game engines I've used in the past. If you're just starting out, I would recommend starting with GameMaker. It's a 2D focused engine with drag and drop functions for beginners, but also has a code editor when you need it to be customizable. And there's still an active community of developers and tutorials, but it does have its limits. The interface isn't the best, at least for me. It only accepts its own language in the code editor, which can be troublesome when you want to figure something out for a specific problem. Developers who have made a name for themselves worked in the constraints of this engine to great effect. Games like Hotline Miami and Undertale were made in GameMaker. But remember, these are the exceptions. This is due to putting in a lot of metaphorical elbow grease and pushing the engine to its limits. I would recommend using this engine to learn and to get your feet wet before moving on. Now, Unity is my weapon of choice. It's one of the most popular engines for indie developers. Games as diverse as Pony Island, Hollow Knight, and Fury were made in Unity. The engine is very modular to the point where you can make almost any kind of game, though you'll need to put in some work to make an online game. It handles both 2D and 3D with ease. Tutorials are abundant, plus its modularity has led to an active asset community, but I'd be lying if I said it was flawless. The physics rigid body system is serviceable if you just want simple physics, but you'll need to put in some effort to make sure that it functions the way you want it to. There's some floatiness where you'll need to make a better jump in code for a platformer. Its art pipeline is getting better, but still leaves much to be desired. The default materials are basic, and if you want to make your own, that would require some shader coding and looking into the still in development shader graph, both of which require some knowledge of HLSL or high-level shader language. And while the assets are super helpful, there's a temptation to flood the project with all these assets, thinking, hey, this'll fix my problem I'm having, right? Or save some time. It does add to the project size and adds unnecessary data when making a build, especially if they're not going to be used. I still like using Unity, it just depends on how you use it. And now, the big one. Unreal Engine. It's by far the most powerful engine that's free. Its art pipeline is the best by far. It takes 2 languages, a visual language called Blueprints, which is an efficient way to iterate and prototype if needed, and it can be extended with C++. Considering that it used to be a fortune back in the day, it's a sweet deal that it's lowered the barrier to entry, mostly because Fortnite's raking in all that cash. Doesn't mean it has an easy learning curve though. There are a lot of tools, which means there's a lot of documentation to go over, which thankfully there's a lot of tutorials. A consequence of having a good art pipeline means that the project file and builds are huge data hogs. Unlike Unity though, the asset and plugin community is much smaller. There's still good stuff to be found, but you have to look for it. Unreal Engine is used for some of the more high-tier indie games, at least in terms of graphical quality, like Abzu and Life is Strange, and is regularly used by big studio games like Kingdom Hearts 3 and Dragon Ball FighterZ. If you're feeling experienced, I recommend you try Unreal. But not just these 3 engines. Try out as many tools as you can and find what works for you. It's all about exploration. Okay, you found your discipline, your tools, and maybe you've done a lot of tutorials, and you feel ready to make your first game. The first thing you need to know is that do not start with your dream project. I know the feeling. You feel like you know what you're doing, and you have that wonderful idea or story that would blow Mario, Metal Gear, Mass Effect, Half-Life, Celeste, Doom, Firewatch, Final Fantasy, or Nier Automata out of the water. But ideas are cheap. Everyone on the team has ideas. That's half the reason they jump to the indies. It's not like being a poet or an artist where you get a bolt of inspiration and you write your poem or drawing in one sitting. Making a dream project takes years of making games and gaining technical knowledge for a very long time. It took Derek Hughes 6 years before getting his big break with Spelunky. Edmund McMillan made Flash games for 8 years, one of which became Super Meat Boy, and Toby Fox made ROM hacks for Earthbound before making Undertale. Not to mention the games that spend years in development hell due to a multitude of reasons. Small teams, overscoping, tough deadlines, people leaving, etc. Stardew Valley took 5 years by one person, not counting QA and publishing. Cuphead took 7 years because of its ambitious art pipeline, and Owlboy took 9 years due to overscoping and cutting features. I started programming around 4 years ago, and I still don't feel ready for my dream project. I'll just close this topic by quoting the ancient poet Aeschylus: "Suffering brings experience." A good way to get said experience is to do game jams, the process of making small games in a short span of time. The big ones are the Global Game Jam and Ludum Dare. These jams are both local and online. If these jams aren't happening, there's always a jam going on at itch.io with varying degrees of time given. A game jam crash courses the game development cycle in a condensed form. It'll expose you to working with a team, which leads to communication, development practices, and it can be counted as networking too. Might even lead to a job later. It's a real experience booster when you finish things. That way you at least have something to show on your portfolio. Downwell's developer, Mappin, or Ojiro Fumoto, did nothing but make short little games before landing a job at Nintendo before leaving months later.
最近はラミ・イスメイルさんの記事を読んで、それがゲームデザインとかを志す人は1週間に1個ゲームを作ってみればいいということを書いてた記事で、それを読んですごく影響を受けて、その当時まだ1個もゲーム作ったことなかったし、ゲームデザインとかを考えてたわけでもなかったんですけど、勉強としていいかなと思ってちっちゃいゲームを作りまくった感じですね。
I forget where I heard this, but when comparing two groups in pottery making, one group was focused on techniques and the other group makes the same pot over and over and over again. When comparing the two groups a week later, the group that was just making the same pot over and over again were determined to be the better potterists. I've included some links that should help, like the optimal game jam schedule, game jam lists, and all that. Practice and repetition helps here, and remember to keep the game simple and low scope. When you're thinking of ideas or trying to be distinct, at least in the case of aesthetics, staying in the gaming anime pool of reference can be very limited because you and millions of other developers are sharing the same ecosystem, and some of them are looking elsewhere. Watch films, read books, study art, whatever else interests you, study it. The more pieces of media you consume, the more you have to draw from. But the most important is life experience. It doesn't have to be drastic. A lot of great games have been made with some of the more mundane experiences like Night in the Woods, or even Hideki Kamiya's childhood experiences in the arcades as the basis for the gameplay of the original Devil May Cry. This is my shortcoming. I don't like sunlight, and being a one-person team doesn't leave much opportunity if I wanted to. At the very least, network with other devs, offline or online, and or draw on something in life. Lastly, I want to recommend two books. Steal Like an Artist by Austin Kleon. And here's where I steal quotes in the book. The only art I'll ever study is stuff that I can steal from. And now it's from David Bowie. What the quote means is not to outright plagiarize, but to study and consume all the work you love, reverse engineer the thinking and methods behind them, and force it through your own creative process to create something all your own. Some examples of this are games like Braid and anything by Hidetaka Miyazaki. Jonathan Blow was inspired by the time reverse mechanic in Prince of Persia: Sands of Time and reworked the time mechanic for Braid to make very unique puzzles. Hidetaka Miyazaki combined the eerie atmosphere of Ico and Shadow of the Colossus with his love of horror, Berserk and the works of H.P. Lovecraft being the most apparent. The main question to ask is, why do you need to take influence from this specific piece of work, other than you just really like it? At least to me. The book's also super short, so there's no excuse not to read it, or failing that, the outline's on the back of the book. The other book I want to recommend is A Theory of Fun by Raph Koster, who was the lead designer on Ultima Online and the creative director of Star Wars Galaxies. Hey, you can't win them all. This is by far the best book on game design I've ever read, and was very influential for my first commercial game, Negative World. It focused a lot on player theory and framing scenarios as a puzzle, which can be levels, bosses, or, well, puzzles. Think, how will this challenge the player with the tools they have? And how can I reinvent them without contradicting the established rules? It's wonderful, and it's also a breezy read. Go get it. Game development is an endless journey. The learning never stops, and it'll never stop. All this should be enough to begin the hunt and start experimenting. Remember, don't be afraid to fail. And if you do feel afraid, I recommend asking the question, what's the worst that could happen? And if it's close to nothing, go ahead and do it. If you have any questions or other topics you'd like me to cover, let me know. I also want to give a special thank you to Welton King, Leet, Pixel Mystique, Tons of Hun Studios, Arcana 4th, Hadakun Dev, and Seppi for sharing their thoughts and making this video better. That'll be it for this one. Subscribe or join the Discord server if you like what I'm doing. Let me know if you have any questions or feedback. Take care of yourselves and have a good week.